got that, to James Siddons, who's the Commercial and Business Development Manager at Griner. And he's going to just tell you a little bit about Griner before we embark on redesigning the biobanking ecosystem. So over to you, James.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's a very brief introduction to Griner. We are a global manufacturer of laboratory plastics, essentially. If you could have the next slide, please. Our product range is relatively varied through blood collection, both capillary and venous, and then also a huge range of general laboratory plastics, which include cell culture, liquid handling, microwell plates, etc. However, the focus, I guess, for today and the reason for our sponsorship is we are a manufacturer and supplier of sample storage products. Next slide, please. So the main items that we would supply, again, I guess would be useful to yourselves from a storage rather than collection point of view, is we do the historical vessels, such as a standard cryovial with standard racking, which most of you will store in 81 or 100 position racks. And then we move across from there into pre-barcoded solutions, whether that's in a 1 to 4 mil situation, again in 48, 81 and 100 racks. And then we also work on smaller systems, which would be 300 to 1,000 microliters. Where we differentiate ourselves from a lot of people who are selling these sorts of items into the market, we are the original manufacturer and therefore have complete traceability. In terms of how we support our sample storage range, we have all the necessary auxiliary products such as scanners, decappers, and we're fully integrated into sort of large high throughput process companies such as Hamilton with their storage systems or their decappers. This week, as well as providing sponsorship, during Friday, we have a talk presented by Dr. Sven Mudenfriedel on good practice in biobanking, a labware manufacturer's perspective. This can be signed up via the community section of the UK Biobanking Showcases app or via our website at www.gbo.com through the know-how and services section. And that's pretty much a very quick introduction from myself.
And James, I think you wanted to just draw everyone's attention to your scanner.
Oh yes, of course, and there is. if you go to yes, a very important point, Amanda. If you go to our section of the exhibitors part of the website and application, there is a free to enter competition to win a scanner.
So that's a real incentive to go and have a look. Thanks very much, James, and thanks again for your support for this event. It's really appreciated.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So now I'm going to move on. I want to introduce you to Mavis Machirori, who's going to speak to us today about fair access to biobanking. Mavis has a background as a midwife, but she's now in academia and she's a researcher in the field of data governance for genomics and health. And she focuses in particular on the ethical collection, use and access to data. She has experience of research with both national and international data access consortia, and her work includes exploring better ways to conduct public engagement in genomic and health data use. She's recently moved from the University of Newcastle and is now based in Glasgow. And over to you, Mavis. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
Thank you, Amanda. Hi, everyone. So I would definitely like to stress my social science background because you'll probably notice that my talk might seem quite biased in that respect. Like Amanda said, I've interviewed researchers as part of my role, so I also understand the concerns that researchers have. And I will say as a caveat, I don't have specific answers to access issues, but I will be outlining a range of ethical and societal as well as governance concerns that I think we need to be thinking about when we talk about fair access. And like I said, this talk might have a bit more of a lean towards patient and publics. Next slide, please. So when we think of the role and scope of biobanks, we must consider, I think, a range of components of fairness, which to me include social activism, justice, and equality. not just around who gets access, but how or how often they get access, but also how the samples are used, and if those people accessing the samples and data and their intentions are in line with the expectations of the sample and data donors. So this is the sort of thinking I'd like to come out in the talk and get you to have at the back of your mind as we continue through this workshop today. The main remit of most biobanks, as most of you will already know, is driven by who funds it. So not all biobanks actually have similar aims. When we think of, for example, large disease-based biobanks funded by patient groups, such as Accelerate, which is a registry for a group of lymph node diseases called Castleman disease, we also have, we notice that their aims might be slightly different to general countrywide population biobanks, which might be funded by public funds, for example, the UK Biobank, or continent-wide repositories like H3 Africa Biorepository, which focuses more on a whole population rather than necessarily disease specific. So although they do diseases, the way that they frame those kind of aims are slightly different. And so for each of these, the aims will be, like I said, different depending on whether they're seeking treatment options for specific diseases, which some might say are niche populations or rare diseases, for example, how they will link the specific repositories to patient data will also be different. Whether they're talking about public health benefits, so access to this would then be focusing on any research that benefits the public rather than looking at a specific disease or disease group. And again, like H3 Africa, if it's a population-based, it's across diseases that affect continents, for instance. Instead of maybe looking at cancer, it might be looking at malaria as something that is pertinent to a particular geographical area. So the collaborations that then emerge from that between the stakeholder groups are going to be different. And in defining what might be equitable and fair, you'll find that this will also differ. And in all of these scenarios, there'll be power dynamics that we'll need attending to. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we need to be able to do when we're thinking about fair access is defining benefit. And if you think back, just the three different types of biobanks that I've alluded to in the previous slide, the benefits that will be described will differ. So what public benefit or what benefit to the researcher and the community that they're working with will be, how that's going to be defined is different. We need to think then about who's making these specific decisions. Is it the PI of the studies that collected the data? Is it the public health body? Is it a private or pharmaceutical company or the biobank itself? And trying to figure this out means we have to understand why that particular benefit is defined as important over other types of benefits. If it is a patient-driven biobank, then for them it might be not only curing disease, but finding therapeutic benefits to help them live life comfortably. If it is a public health registry, it might be hypothesis-driven rather and describing study populations rather than particularly trying to figure out diagnostics or therapies for a disease. I also acknowledge here that the type of researcher will impact on what is fair use. And we know from literature and studies that public participants or NHS-based donors usually are not keen to have commercial or government agencies accessing their data. So what is fair in that regard is going to look different, especially when we think about the increasing turn to precision medicine. We have to consider now that although it's still in the kind of developing phase, there's a lot of increasing interest in using biobanks for forensic use. So how will this look if people giving people donating their samples say they don't want government agencies or forensics to access their information or their samples, and you have a court order saying we need to access this sample? What is fair going to look like? So you can find that there'll be competing demands in this. Again, the collaborations and innovative practices that need to emerge from the use of samples will also drive what is considered fair. There is no one research team, however, it doesn't matter how good a track record the research team is, there's no one team that can do all of these things in what is fair and equitable. So we need to really think about innovation, not just in public benefit terms, but also to be balanced with potential harms, profits for commercial companies, benefits and expectations of all the different stakeholders in the community. Next slide, please. And so when we think of competing demands. You'll see from this slide that they're all like, this is just I guess, one way of breaking down the different stakeholders, where you've got data access committees, you've got data donors, data users, and funders. But for each of these, how we think about fair access to samples and data is going to be driven, like I said, by the different aims. We have to think about who are we defining benefit for. When the samples were accessed, for example, is it for people, is the benefit for people who donated altruistically? Is it for people affected by a particular condition, even if they haven't donated their samples necessarily? Is it people from one geographic area who are going to benefit, or from another geographic area? And so when you're accessing samples, then you have to try and outline what these benefits are and who that benefit is for, and try and strike a balance between better public health, profits, and allowing a diverse range of data users to access the samples. Some people may already have said in donating their data or their samples that they don't want certain kind of researchers or certain questions to be conducted on their data. So how do we then define what is fair if we're not saying, if we're looking at a group of people rather than as individuals? Think, for example, of NHS leftover samples. Some people don't even know that their samples are collected after, left as clinical leftover tissue. So when we then get researchers to access these samples, how do we talk about the benefits of the use of those samples when people don't even know that their samples are being kept, for instance? And so next slide, please. And also when we think about in a pandemic, should samples be reappropriated for critical research, or do we continue to use them as previous consents might have dictated? So for each of these groups, you'll start to see that what is fair is actually different and can't really be delineated so clearly. Remember that when people donate samples, they may, like I said, not want external researchers accessing their samples. And I actually think this actually happens a lot more than is acknowledged usually. I think for this, researchers need to think about the protections of people providing their data. This is usually I guess, the background thinking for data access committees. They want to protect the people who've given their data, but sometimes that protection goes a little bit too far and stops researchers accessing the samples. So actually you'll find that some people are like, well, no, use our samples because they have been given for research. And we need to strike that balance between protecting people and ensuring that research goes forward. There's something that you might have heard called helicopter research, where researchers collect samples from maybe indigenous populations or people in low and middle income countries, and then take those samples away from those geographical areas. So then the researchers in the local areas don't actually get benefit from those samples because they can't then access the samples that they collected themselves. And there's a lot of controversy around Ebola samples, for instance. The Hava-Supai tribe, whose samples were used for different other research that they hadn't consented to. So you start to see that fair access is not just about the physical access to the samples, but how those samples are used. You could talk about fair in terms and think about maybe payment for people to take part in research, but that also brings its own ethical concerns, like what value and who defines what is a valuable sample and what isn't. Next slide, please. So like I said, it's about the questions that we ask, the methodologies that we use. For example, with AI and machine learning, we suddenly move from hypothesis to prediction. So as we access samples and derive data from it, we have to think about what claims we make. Could they be psychologically harmful? Could the results that we come up with, could they be discursive or stigmatizing? So it's not then just about who is being researched, but also who isn't being researched. And a lot of talk at the moment is about diversity in research. And yet at the same time, we know that while we say minority populations should take part in research, their samples are not actually used because there's so few samples, they don't drive the required statistical significance. So is that fair to continue to get samples and then not use them because of this drive towards reproducibility and statistical significance? Next slide, please. So considering fair access is not just about physically accessing samples, but it's about thinking about consent, thinking about the impact on publics and participants and patients. We need better collaboration with different lay and professional stakeholders. And this can also include getting lay citizens to ask questions of the samples and data. but it's also about dialogue and social contracts. Next slide, please. We need meaningful guidance that will go beyond thinking only of samples and their lifespan, but the data that is derived from it. And transparency is really important. I don't have any time really, but we need to think about collaborations versus data hogging, transparency about where data is kept, how to access it, and what consents come with those samples, and also actionable penalties for the misuse of data and samples, because this will be about fairness and justice for the participants as well. And on the last slide, as a social scientist, obviously I'm going to advocate that you get social scientists involved in your work at whichever level, whether you're a funder or a researcher, because hopefully what I've shown is the different kinds of issues that we need to be thinking about when we talk about fair access. And you can quickly see that it gets really messy. But yeah, these are just some of the thoughts that I have in talking about fair access. Thank you.
Mavis, thank you very, very much. That was a really interesting, thoughtful talk. I think we should have given you an hour on it rather than 10 minutes. That's fascinating. And that sets the scene now for thinking about designing our new ecosystem. I'm going to hand over to Jessica now, who's going to explain the sort of choreography of how the next bit is going to work. So Jessica, over to you. Who was in room one? Room one was a funder. And have we got somebody to
I was in room one. I don't know if we picked a rep before I joined. Martin, do you want to do it?
No, we haven't, and I'm not ready. You can do it, Emma.
Okay.
Well,
I can summarize some of our key points, but I was in and out of the room a bit. So we talked about a few themes. We talked about things because we use a bullseye, as you can see. So we started off talking about some things that might affect the funders and their funders' decision making. As you can see, like market and law and the popularity of research themes, things like that. And then we started talking about how we'd like funding to work ideally, and how at the moment some diseases might not be as popular or interesting, and so might not get as much funding, even though they have quite a big impact on some people's lives. So we talked about collecting a percentage from tax and allocating that to sort of non-trendy disease areas or research topics. What else did we talk about? Yeah, I think that was it. And how, yeah, basically how medical research should be seen as our healthcare and our medical research, our medical healthcare. So sort of funding should be included in as part of our National Health Service. Did I miss anything, Martin? No, I think that was mostly the things we talked about.
There was tense conversation.
Yeah,
the 20 minutes.
Very political.
Yeah.
Martin, do you want to add anything into that? Martin, give us a flavour of the tense conversation. I'm interested.
Oh no, sorry. We kind of opened the can of worms with the collecting the percentage from the taxpayers and being funded by the NHS, because that would just create a massive politics and a lobby groups in the government, and obviously some research projects would suffer because they'll be favoured one over the others. But I think the bottom line was there's no utopia in that word, and it's just so hard to come up with the perfect scenario that would work for everyone. If it would work for the funder, it would definitely not work for the research groups, and vice versa, I'm sure.
I can see a very worrying utilitarian argument coming up there about greatest numbers or spread of, or whether you go for funding the smaller groups of diseases. Could be a real issue. Could be a lot of funding for diabetes and nothing else, isn't it?
Yeah, because they would just be basically picked on the trending topic of a non-trending topic, and that's not the way we want to work.
Ideal moment to bring in Mavis. This is right up your street. Mavis, are you hiding? Or have you got a comment? Maybe I'll come back to her later. Okay, thank you very much. For anybody else in group one want to add anything else to
Sorry,
that.
Amanda, I was busy trying to unmute myself, and I was just like, ah.
I thought there was a perfect equity argument going on there.
No, I think that was really interesting because thinking back to one of the things I said about the idea of market value, you start to think about how do you define this, right? So do you go by diseases that cost the most to the public health sector, or diseases that are rare but really have an awful impact on someone's health, and who defines that? And like has already been said, sometimes the loudest participants might form a small group, and there'll be a lot of lobbying, and I think it's really difficult. And as a funder, I think the best thing to do would be to let researchers come and define use rather than putting these limits. But I recognize, as already been said, that it's really difficult to say this is the remit of our research, because if you decide to go with one disease, if it's a general population biobank, a lot of people are going to be upset about that. I think that's a difficult one. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So do you think that the current system, probably for all its faults,
does it work? I think if it's publicly funded, then people should be able, like every stakeholder should know what kind of research is being conducted, because some of the questions that come up would then be, do scientists continue to ask the same questions for reproducibility, or do we say this question was already asked, we need to move on and find new questions to answer? If it's a patient led biobank, then they get to define, because I suppose they're the ones who are putting time and effort. And sometimes if it's, let's say, a rare disease, they really have a very different focus. And if it's too expensive to do that research, you can sort of see why public funding might, the argument might be, we're not funding this rare disease because we've got diabetes and high blood pressure, for instance.
Okay. Thank you. So room 2 is a commercial researcher. Maybe their aims and motivations are more clearly defined, perhaps. Who's my person feeding back from room 2?
Hello, can you all hear me?
Hello.
Hello. So we actually had some people who we didn't really have to act. We actually had some people, and I think it's fair to say that whether they were SMEs or very large pharma, there were some things in common that would be in common to both, and then there were some challenges that only the SMEs would have. So something that was in round agreement was, if I'll start with the top left, so they have a set timescale. I need to find something in this time period. Please, can I have an answer? So finding biobanks who actually have the tools available to answer those questions in the timescale needed is quite difficult. From the biobank perspective, partly that's because it's time consuming to try and predict every bit of data that might be asked of that sample, because a patient will have had several diseases in their life, quite honestly. So it's finding the time to attach all that data to every single sample so that it is maximally of use when people ask questions of you about it. And then the amount of time, particularly the SMEs, seem to need to spend negotiating MTAs and recs when they don't have the personnel or at least the staff hours to be able to do that, because they're an SME, particularly if they're a startup, they're working like crazy. That's a challenge that they have. So if we can pan...
Can I move you around your beautiful diagram a little faster, because I've got to get around all the rooms.
Sorry, yes. I was just going to say, if we can pan right, because I can't see it. So, if we were allowed to have anything, having a centralized biobank system that could tap into what is still quite a nascent thing, but in the NHS, there are some hospitals that have truly electronic patient records that can link into National Cancer Registry and Somerset House and stuff like that. So to be able to link the biobank into that saves us having to, as biobanks, put in that data, which means it's much more easy to pull it back out again to answer the questions. Centralized help with the rec approval, one application for UK-wide use. we didn't actually, I don't think we actually got to discuss that, but that is clearly an issue.
So a sort of Scottish system you're looking at? Yeah.
Yeah.
What have we got in your bottom half?
It may not be a single rec, but as has been discussed elsewhere, you know, one rec is good as the other, a bit like they do with the MHRA versus EMA and other other drug systems. No, sorry, I'm regurgitating nonsense now because I'm concentrating on the screen. So legal financial support for research and biobank fair system. Oh yeah, so the fairness of the system. You know, where is this fair and this fair? It's making sure the academics don't get crowded out because the commercials can offer more money, but equally it's ensuring the commercials get a fair pop at the a crack at it, because we're not going, oh no, this is just for academics, it's for the greater good. And then and then if we span right, discoverability, two-way info. So it's kind of that's more detail of what we've previously discovered.
Really helpful. Thank you, Gareth. And I think particularly interesting because I think that it's interesting to hear the sort of the commercial people saying they normally get elbowed out by the academics. That's not normally the way around that we hear, is it?
No, it's not.
Mavis, I'm going to move on to room 3. Is that all right? Or did you have anything to comment on that one?
It's just one of the things that I thought didn't come out, but that I know from other researchers is the idea of just, I mean, somebody actually said, Ross talked about discoverability. In terms of collaboration, a lot of academic researchers sometimes find that it's difficult to know where the samples are because it depends on who you know. And I was just wondering how commercial researchers might, work through that, because if it's sort of on a group because you've worked with them before, if you're a commercial researcher, you might not have the same access to, academic researchers.
I'm going to leave that thought hanging, and I'm going to ask for the room 3 spokesperson. Who's our room 3 person? Thank you, Gareth. Room 3? Anybody going to put their head above the parapet? We've got a nice picture. Who is room 3? Phil, do you know who room 3 is?
No, I don't. I think Amir was in room 3.
Amir.
I was in room 3, but I'm biased, so I don't want to. I didn't really want to step in.
Have you got a spokesperson to run? So it looks like a very big picture, and we've only got about a minute to go through it. So
okay, very briefly, we were looking at creating a bioresource, and what we did was we put together all the different things we thought would be necessary and started to discuss some of the things that might be interesting to change. One area that was touched upon was finances, and making sure that the finances reflect what the true cost of setting up such a large bioresource would be. And some of I can't think, what were the other things that we talked about? We talked about systems, bringing together systems, consolidating systems into a centralized way of doing things so that it becomes more efficient generally. I think that was the take-home message.
And did you think about room 2's idea of having a single bioresource?
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's that type of idea. Bring critical mass of activity to increase efficiency. Yeah.
Mavis, any thoughts?
I like the access and sharing rules and the consent, whether it's broad or tiered, because I think actually those two are constantly needing to be flexible. So as a biobank, you need to be thinking about how you can ensure that the public or like your participants are constantly aware of the changes, and also seeing if people are still happy with that. And consent shouldn't just be a single time point, but you should continue to go back to say, does this still work? Do we need to change things?
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, so the next room is room 4, which is the one I was in. I think that Emma is going to be our...
Yes, I just had
we made a bit of a list, didn't we, on what we'd like to change?
We started on the bullseye, but changed our mind very quickly as this was more accurate of the type of story that we wanted to build up. So we took the example of an academic researcher working in cancer, and what is going to drive them really is a desire for quality and reproducible research, and including to be able to find samples and data that are consistent with their with the fitness for the intended purpose. They're going to be driven by funding, and the ability to source the samples and data as well. So it's a little bit like what Mavis was saying earlier on. It depends on who you know. So that we repeat this further down. So looking at establishing maybe funders enabling formal networks for better use and better findability, if you like, of the biobanks that have the biological resources that you require. So we would be concerned about maybe lack of harmonized systems, lack of harmonized pricing, maybe effect of value versus effect of the quality versus value for money. If money is tight, are you going to go and chase samples maybe that don't have quality associated with them quite as much? So issues with agreements and contractual requirements and IP ownership is a big thing as well. You know, who owns the samples? We were talking about maybe the hogging of material locally that might be ongoing, you know, really gaining access, whether that's possible or not. And maybe funders can help in this whole area by introducing, encouraging best practice and maybe equality of access. And as I said, formal networks of better use and better expenditure. And post-funding, where will the samples be located? So that's consideration of a biobank when it's starting up. Do the funders ask what's going to happen to those samples that are unused after a certain period of time? Have you got a business plan in place if the main PI leaves, et cetera, you know, maybe looking at what's the long-term sustainability of the biobank or after its collection phase has been completed.
Thank you, Emma. That's great. Thank you. Anybody else from room 4 want to come in? Don't all shout at once. Mavis, have you got any thoughts about that?
I always find IP ownership a really interesting one because, like Emma said, if you know who owns the sample might define who gets the IP, I suppose. And I could be wrong, but I always think sometimes academic researchers, for all the work that they put into, the conditions around IP and ownership actually might be unfair to them versus commercial researchers. But that's just a personal.
Yeah. Gareth, I can see you waving in the distance.
Sorry, nobody owns the sample. Very strict matter of law. Nobody owns the sample. The patient has the right to withdraw consent for use of that sample. Nobody owns the sample. It's the IP that can get owned, but nobody owns that sample.
Thank you. That's good clarification.
But I will just add there, actually, it's a perception of that. So I created this biobank. I decide what happens to it. You know, it's rather than strictly saying they're my samples. You know, it's I have the power, we'll say, to deciding. I think it's this whole hogging business as well. It does actually happen. It needs to be considered, I think.
It's a real problem.
Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And finally, room 5. Who's my speaker for room 5?
Oh.
Shall I speak? Or
yeah, Nita, go for it, then I will help you, support you.
Nita, do you put your camera on?
Okay.
Lovely, thank you.
So we had the funder as our central person. Oh, no, sorry, not the funder, the donor.
You're the donor.
The donor, yeah. Yeah, we're the donor. So we said our donor was a hospital participant with a particular disease or condition. So the people they were mainly concerned with was their healthcare professionals, so their doctors, the nurses, people they see in clinic. Also patient organisations and charities, because that's who they get their independent information from. So those places might tell them about what research studies are on, what biobanks there are happening, those sort of things. Also family members are really important on making decisions. So mainly they have the healthcare professionals and also the biobank staff and the biobank website, and it's through them that they get information back about what happened with their samples, what the results of things are. They're the main things that we discuss.
Mavis, any thoughts?
I think transparency is really important, especially when we're looking at donors and their expectations. A lot of the controversy comes with people not quite understanding the processes of what happens when they've given a sample. And I know Gareth said nobody owns the sample, but sometimes that's not the perception people have. They own that. A lot of people feel that the sample still belongs to them and it's just been, loaned. So I think public engagement around all of these issues about the expectations of the sample and the data that's returned, and also feedback from results, like Nita said, is really important. Otherwise, people feel as if they're just being taken for a ride, like they give, and never get any feedback back.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much. I think we've probably just about run out of time. The last question for Group 5 is, who put a heart on the board? Well, thank you very much. Thank you for all your participation. So I think that draws that to a close for today. Particularly want to thank Mavis for a very thought-provoking talk at the beginning of today's session, and to everybody from the TDCC for getting us organised today. I think it's been a really good session. Thank you too for joining, for making time in your day. 4 o'clock this afternoon, there's a sort of drop-in login to chat. That's about recruiting public members to review boards. So if you're interested in that subject, then join in at 4 o'clock today, and then there'll be the last session 1:30 tomorrow. So thanks very much and have a good day, everybody.